On nights when silence wraps around you and the world outside grows still, there's a special magic in letting a story lead you gently toward sleep. Here, beneath the hush of darkness, we invite you to settle in and let your imagination wander. Where every whisper and shadow promises a journey beyond the ordinary. Before you drift into sleep, let our soothing horror tales guide your dreams. Subscribe to Dark Night Chronicles TV for nightly stories that whisper through the shadows. Tap subscribe and journey into the night with us. They say old houses remember. Not just the grand, crumbling mansions you see in old black and white. Movies, not just the haunted ruins whispered about on cold October nights, but every home with a history, every place that's seen more than a single life pass through its doors. Sometimes when you stand in the quiet of a place long empty, it's easy to imagine it's listening, that it knows you even before you step across the threshold. When I first saw the Briar Hollow farmhouse, I didn't believe in such things. I was a practical man, still am, in many ways. I believed in logic, in the comforting weight of facts. Ghost stories were for campfires, for children desperate to see monsters in the shadows under their beds. But there's something about loneliness that sharpens your senses, that makes the improbable seem just a little more possible. I'd spent years drowning in the noise of city life, surrounded by crowds and chaos, and a kind of emptiness that never truly left you. When my job ended, when my friends scattered, when I found myself with nothing but time and a weary ache that wouldn't fade, I decided to start over somewhere quiet, somewhere I could breathe. Briar Hollow sat on the edge of a forgotten county, wrapped in fields that faded into mist each morning. I'd found the listing online, one of those grainy, half-lit photographs that seemed to hum with the ghosts of past owners. The house was old, yes, but something about its sagging porch and shuttered windows called to me. The drive out was longer than I expected, the road narrowing until I wondered if I'd taken a wrong turn. But when I crested the last hill and saw the house standing alone against the wild tangle of oaks and pines, I felt a shiver of possibility. I could have turned back then. I almost did, if I'm honest. But sometimes fate doesn't give you the choice you think you have. I met the real estate agent, a woman named Joy, though there was nothing joyful about her demeanor. Her voice was brisk, practical, almost cold as she handed me the keys. She pointed out the quirks, the leaky faucet, the uneven floors, the draft that whistled beneath the doors in winter. She never quite looked me in the eye. As I signed the final paper, I caught her glancing at the house with an expression that could only be described as wary. "She's a good house," Joy said softly, as if the building itself might be listening. "She just remembers things." I laughed it off, but her words clung to me all the same. When I stepped inside for the first time, it was like crossing into another life. The scent of dust and old wood filled my lungs, heavy with memory. Light filtered through the wavy glass, scattering across worn floorboards, scratched by generations of shoes and furniture. I ran my hand along the banister, feeling the grooves worn smooth by decades of use. The silence was nearly complete, save for the faint ticking of a clock somewhere deep in the house, a sound I would come to know intimately in the nights that followed. At first, the quiet was a balm. After the constant din of the city, the hush felt like a luxury. I unpacked my boxes slowly, arranging my few belongings as if they might anchor me to this strange new world. In the evenings, I'd sit by the window with a mug of coffee, watching the sun sink below the fields, the sky bruised with purple and gold. I wrote letters I never sent, jotting thoughts on the back of grocery lists or napkins, trying to make sense of my own restless mind. And every night, as I climbed the stairs to bed, I'd pause in the hallway, listening to the deep, soft creaks of the house settling into darkness. But then, as the days wore on, something changed. It began with the faintest suggestion, a sound so quiet I thought it was my imagination. A hush, a sigh, the barest whisper beneath the floorboards. I told myself it was nothing, just the old wood contracting in the cool of the night, or maybe a mouse scurrying through the walls. I laughed at my own unease, mocking the old stories that seemed to linger in every corner. But with each passing night, the whispers grew clearer, threading themselves through my dreams, pulling me deeper into a mystery I never meant to find. If you've ever lived alone in a place older than you are, you know the way silence can change. At first, it's empty, then, slowly it becomes crowded, thick with things left unsaid. The house pressed in around me, its shadows lengthening as the sun slipped away. And always those whispers soft, persistent, curling up from beneath. Floor like a secret begging to be told. Looking back now, I wonder if I was ever really alone in Briar Hollow, or if the house was simply waiting for someone to listen to it. This is the story of what I found, or perhaps more honestly, of what found me. Chapter 1. Arrival. The road to Briar Hollow twisted through the countryside, a ribbon of cracked asphalt bordered by wild grass and ancient, lichen-crusted stone fences. My old sedan bounced along every rut, the engine humming like a tired wasp. The day I arrived, a pale sun drifted behind restless clouds, and a hush settled over the landscape as if the earth itself was holding its breath. Fields rolled away on either side, dotted here and there by stubborn oaks, their bare branches clutching at the sky. In that wide, lonely expanse, the house felt less like a structure and more like a memory that refused to fade out as I pulled into the gravel drive. The tires crunched a tune that vanished almost instantly into the hush. Briar Hollow was just as I remembered from the listing, maybe even older. The paint, once bright, had faded to a ghostly white, peeling in curls like pages of a forgotten letter. The porch sagged, its wooden steps groaning beneath my weight. When I climbed them, the front door stood slightly ajar, swinging with a lazy, ominous creak that seemed to welcome and warn in equal measure. I paused at the threshold, my duffel bag slung over my shoulder, and listened. No birds, no distant tractors or barking dogs, only the wind in the grass and the steady beat of my heart. I stepped inside. The air was cool and heavy, holding the faintest sense of old books, mothballs, and something subtler floral and earthy, like the memory of a garden left to rot. Light struggled in through the wavy glass windows, pooling on the floor in rippled patterns. Dust motes hung suspended, turning lazily in the air, as if time here moved at a different pace that my footsteps echoed in the entryway. The floorboards flexed under my boots, whispering their complaints. I let my fingers brush the wallpaper, its faded pattern of roses almost lost beneath generations of grime. Each detail whispered of lives lived and lost. A scuffed spot by the door, where someone's boots must have stood for decades. A thumbprint worn into the edge of the banister. A nail hammered askew, as if by a trembling hand. The kitchen was at the back, tucked beneath the slanting ceiling. I opened the old fridge, half expecting it to be empty, but found a jar of pickles and a carton of milk, long expired. I laughed, maybe a bit too loudly at the absurdity, then shut the door gently, as if afraid to wake something slumbering in the walls. I explored room by room, each space unfolding like a chapter I wasn't sure I wanted to read. The dining room was filled with shadows, the table and chairs shrouded in old sheets like sleeping ghosts. The living room boasted a fireplace, choked with ash and memories, its mantel lined with orphaned candlesticks, and a chipped porcelain clock that ticked, faint and insistent, even when I tried to wind it. Upstairs, the bedrooms waited in a silence so dense it almost rang. The master bedroom, mine by default, faced east, and I imagined the morning sun spilling in across the wrinkled sheets, casting shapes I'd learned to interpret in the dark. I set my bag on the bed and opened the window, breathing in the sharp, green scent of distant rain. I unpacked slowly, more to fill the silence than out of any real need. Books, shirts, an old photo album. Each item felt like a link to a life I'd left behind. A city apartment filled with sirens and neon. Late-night takeout, friends who no longer called. Here, in Briar Hollow, my world had shrunk to the size of an old farmhouse, and the secrets it kept close dot by mid-afternoon. Clouds gathered overhead, heavy with promise. I sat on the porch steps, sipping coffee from a chipped mug I'd found in a cabinet, and watched as rain painted the fields silver. The smell of wet earth rose up around me, mingling with the scent of old wood and distant, blooming honeysuckle. For the first time in months, my mind felt quiet. A car appeared on the lane, a blue pickup, crawling slow. It stopped at the gate, and an elderly woman emerged, her hair the color of new snow beneath a plastic rain hood. She waved, her smile warm, but tinged with caution. "Afternoon," she called, voice clear as church bells. "You must be the new owner. I'm Margaret. Hemsworth lived just down the road." We talked a while, our conversation weaving between pleasantries and the practicalities of country living. Margaret told me about the best place to buy bread, where to take my trash, the days the postman made his rounds. Her eyes lingered on the house, softening with something like nostalgia or maybe regret. "Old place has stood a long time," she said quietly, almost as if to herself. "Some folks say it remembers everything that happens within its walls." I smiled politely, not sure how to reply. She handed me a plate wrapped in foil apple pie, still warm from her oven, and bid me good luck before disappearing back into the drizzle dot. As dusk gathered, I wandered the halls with pie in hand, the house creaking softly around me. I ate by the window, watching night swallow the fields, the lights of Margaret's house winking on in the distance. When I finally climbed the stairs to bed, my footsteps seemed too loud, as if announcing my presence to whatever watched from the shadows dot in the darkness. The house felt impossibly vast. My breath echoed in the stillness. The clock downstairs ticked out its slow, patient rhythm. I lay awake, listening to the wind scrape branches against the siding, the rain trickling through the gutters, then faint. So faint I almost missed it. I heard it. A whisper, softer than the wind, quieter than the rain. It came from below, somewhere deep beneath the floorboards, rising and falling in a rhythm older than the house itself. I held my breath, straining to listen. Was it a voice? A memory? Or simply the house settling into its ancient bones? Sleep came slowly that night, wrapped in the scent of rain and old wood and the sound of whispers that might have been nothing at all, or the beginning of something I could not yet name. Chapter 2. Settling in. My first full day at Briar Hollow began with sunlight slipping through warped glass, painting the bedroom walls in drowsy golden stripes. The world was muffled by a lingering fog, a pale mist rolling over the fields, blurring the boundaries between dream and waking. For a moment, I lay still, listening, half expecting to hear city traffic or the murmur of neighbors. Instead, there was only the soft tap of dew slipping from the eaves and, beneath it all, that low, peculiar hush that seemed to belong to the house alone. Getting up, I shivered as my bare feet touched the cold, uneven floorboards. I padded downstairs, making my way through rooms still heavy with shadows. The kitchen greeted me with a stubborn chill. The old radiator wheezed when I coaxed it to life, filling the space with the scent of rust and dust. I brewed coffee and watched the steam rise, feeling like a stranger in my own home, my movements careful, tentative, as if I was a guest not yet welcome. I spent the morning unpacking, filling cupboards with familiar things: coffee mugs, chipped plates, a favorite frying pan, The act was grounding, a way of claiming the space as my own. I played old jazz records on a battered turntable, the scratchy music drifting down the hall, its warmth just enough to soften the silence. Still, every time the music faded, the quiet pressed in again, thick and watchful. As the fog lifted, I wandered from room to room, inspecting every nook and cranny. The house was larger than I'd realized, its rooms arranged in a strange, meandering fashion. The floors sloped gently in places, the walls bulged with hidden memories, and the windows wore the cloudy patina of 1,000 storms. There were closets that led nowhere, doors that stuck in their frames, and a narrow staircase spiraling up to an attic I had yet to explore. I found comfort in the ordinary rituals, opening windows to air out musty spaces, sweeping dust from corners, hanging my coats in the hall. In the living room, I draped a worn blanket over the old couch, arranging pillows in the vain hope that their colors would brighten the gloom. By noon, the house felt less like a relic and more like a promise, place that, with enough time, might remember how to be warm again. Mid-afternoon brought a visit from Margaret Hemsworth. She arrived bearing a basket of fresh bread, her footsteps certain as she made her way up the drive. We sat on the porch together, the bread between us, our conversation meandering through stories of neighbors long gone, fields that once grew, corn, and the stubborn resilience of the old place. "There's always an adjustment period with a house like this," she said, her gaze fixed on the horizon. "Takes time for a home to trust its new owner, and for you to trust it back." She smiled, a secret tucked behind her words. I nodded, not entirely understanding, but grateful for her company. The day faded into evening with remarkable swiftness. I cooked dinner in the tiny kitchen, the scent of onions and garlic filling the air. I ate in silence, watching the last pink threads of sunset vanish behind the trees. The quiet was less oppressive now, gentler, like a thick quilt pulled up around my shoulders. Afterward, I took a slow walk around the property. The yard was larger than I'd thought, hemmed in by wild hedges and old barbed wire fences. I traced the lines of a long-forgotten garden, where daffodils pushed through tangled grass, and a lone bird bath listed to one side, filled with muddy water and yellow leaves. The barn at the far end of the lot was locked tight, its doors groaning in the wind. Returning inside, I locked the doors and checked the windows, an old habit from city life. I lit candles, their glow flickering against the cracked plaster and dusty frames, casting strange, wavering shadows along the walls. The house seemed to sigh, settling around me, its bones creaking with satisfaction or warning. Night came early, swallowing the last light with greedy hunger. Upstairs I read for a while, my book heavy in my hands. Sleep felt elusive, my mind spinning with images of rain-soaked fields, Margaret's half-told stories, and the odd sense that the house was not just sheltering me, but watching me in return. Lying in bed, I listened to the hush, the way the wind moaned through the attic, the way the walls murmured secrets only they could understand. I heard the steady tick of the clock in the hallway, and somewhere below, the distant hum of the radiator. The silence grew deeper, more layered, until it pressed against my ears like a physical thing. And then, as I drifted on the edge of sleep, I heard it again, that subtle, unmistakable whisper, curling up from beneath the floorboards. It was softer, then breath, a thread of sound too faint to decipher, but it was there, insistent, patient, waiting. I squeezed my eyes shut, heart fluttering in my chest. Maybe it was nothing, just a draft, a mouse, the tired trick of a restless mind. Still, I listened, letting the sound lull me, until finally, exhaustion pulled me down into dreams, crowded with shadows and voices just beyond understanding. When morning came, the house felt the same yet not, as if something had changed in the night, something small and silent, shifting beneath the surface of my new life. Chapter 3. Echoes in the Silence. Days at Briar Hollow slipped by with a quiet insistence, each one folding gently into the next. The routines I built for myself, cleaning, repairing, wandering the fields, were a balm for my restless mind. But as the novelty of country life faded, I began to notice the peculiarities that set the house apart from any place I'd ever lived. It started in the late afternoons, when sunlight, strained and weary, slanted through the kitchen windows. I'd be washing dishes, the hot water stinging my hands, when I'd catch a soft, uneven rhythm beneath my feet. Not the loud, obvious creaks of settling wood, but something quieter, more deliberate. A brushing, a tapping, like the gentle sweep of fingers across piano keys. I would pause, dish suspended above the sink, straining to listen. Always, the sound would fade before I could pinpoint its source, leaving me doubting whether I'd heard anything at all. At first, I dismissed these noises as the house stretching its bones, adjusting to my presence. Old places, I reminded myself, have their ways. They groan, they sigh, they remember every footstep. But as the nights grew longer and the winds grew colder, the sounds became harder to ignore. It was during these evenings that I truly learned the weight of silence. In the city, quiet was never truly silent. There was always a car alarm in the distance, the rumble of the subway, the hum of a neighbor's television. Here, the hush was absolute, a vast blanket thrown across the world. At times it felt comforting, but more often it felt heavy, as if the house itself was waiting for me to listen. I began to keep a journal, scribbling down every odd occurrence, every whisper of sound. My handwriting grew jagged, my thoughts spiraling into questions I was afraid to ask out loud. Was I hearing things? Had the isolation finally begun to erode my sanity? Each entry started with certainty and ended with doubt. Some nights, sleep came easily, and I would wake refreshed, the previous evening's unease brushed away by sunlight and the promise of another ordinary day. Other nights, I would lie awake for hours, listening to the faint chorus rising from beneath the floorboards. The sounds were growing clearer, not just whispers now, but distinct words, syllables strung together in patterns that almost made sense. It was on one such night that the silence finally broke. I was reading in bed, the house swaddled in darkness, when I heard my name spoken in a voice so soft I thought it was my own thought echoing back at me. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. Again, the whisper, Elijah. It came from the floor, from the old boards beneath my bed. The sound was barely audible, but the way it wrapped around my name, tender and urgent, left no doubt that it was real. I swung my legs over the edge of the mattress and knelt, pressing my ear to the cool wood. My breath fogged against the surface. At first, there was nothing, just the distant groan of wind outside, the faint crackle of the radiator. Then, a new sound, a slow rhythmic tapping, like someone drumming gentle fingers against the underside of the floor. I whispered, "Who's there?" feeling foolish, but unable to help myself. There was no answer, only the soft, persistent tapping, and beneath it, the sigh of breath that did not belong to me. I pulled away, scrambling back onto the bed, clutching the blanket to my chest. Sat in the darkness, my mind racing, every shadow in the room suddenly alive with possibility. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. When dawn finally came, I scoured the floor for any sign of disturbance, loose boards, cracks, mouse droppings, anything to explain what I'd heard. The wood was cold and unyielding, worn smooth by time, but otherwise unremarkable. Yet the feeling lingered, a weight pressing down from the ceiling, an awareness that had not been there before. That afternoon, I called Margaret, my only friend, in this new, quiet world. I told her, as casually as I could, about the noises, the voices, the feeling that something or someone was living in the silence beneath my feet. Margaret listened, her voice calm and unhurried, as if she'd heard it all before. "Old houses have stories," she said finally. "Sometimes they just need someone to listen. Don't be afraid of it, Elijah. Most memories can't hurt you." But that night, as I lay awake listening to the floorboards whisper my name, I wondered if she was right. I wondered if memories could reach up from the past, seeking someone who would finally listen. The next days blurred together. Each evening, the whispers grew a little louder, a little clearer, twining through the rooms like threads of smoke. I tried to ignore them, to focus on repairs and small comforts, but the house would not let me forget. It pressed its story against my skin, breathing it into my dreams, until the boundary between waking and sleeping began to unravel. In that strange, shifting silence, I began to realize the truth. I was not alone in Briar Hollow. I never had been, and as I sat in the quiet, my hand trembling above the journal, I began to write, not just for myself, but for the voices beneath the floor, for whatever lingered in the hush, waiting to be remembered. Chapter 4. The Ticking Clock. Time in Briar Hollow moved differently, each hour drawn out by the silence that wrapped itself around the house like a thick woolen blanket. I started to notice the way the sunlight would shift across the floor, how the dust in the air caught the afternoon light, swirling in tiny storms. But more than anything, I became obsessed with the clocks. There were clocks everywhere. The porcelain clock on the mantel, its hands frozen at 3:17. A brass carriage. Clock on the upstairs landing, ticking with stubborn persistence. And most notably, the grandfather clock in the hallway, a relic of another century, tall and grave, with a face that bore the weight of 100 years. The clock's tick became the rhythm of my days, a steady heartbeat in the hush of the house. At first, it was comforting. At night, it soothed me, the sound carrying up the stairs like a lullaby. But as the days passed, I started to feel watched. The clock's face was always turned slightly toward me, no matter where I stood. Its chimes echoed at odd hours, sometimes refusing to sound at midnight, ringing instead at 2 a.m. or 4:07, as if marking its own secret calendar. One evening, as I sat on the couch with a book, I realized the ticking had changed. It was slower, now heavier, almost dragging. I set the book aside, feeling the prickling urge to check the hallway. The house was dark, the only light a thin slice from the kitchen lamp. As I stepped into the hall, the grandfather clock loomed above me, the brass pendulum swinging in lazy arcs. I leaned closer, listening. Beneath the tick, another sound pulsed, something soft and persistent, like a whisper folded into the clock's song. My skin prickled, the hairs on my arms rising. Elijah, my name again. A murmur, winding through the gears, threading itself into the space beneath the floor. I pressed my ear to the clock's polished wood, feeling the cool surface beneath my skin. For a moment, everything else faded. The silence, the shadows, even the fear that had clung to me like a second skin. All that remained was the voice, sorrowful, insistent, begging to be heard. Elijah, help us. I staggered back, heart hammering. The house seemed to breathe around me, the floor trembling with barely restrained energy. I stumbled into the kitchen, hands shaking as I gripped the edge of the counter. My reflection stared back at me from the dark window eyes, wide, mouth drawn in a thin, uncertain line. Was I losing my mind? Was this just the isolation, the endless quiet, making me hear things that weren't there? I wanted to believe that, more than anything. But the voice was so real, so achingly present. The next morning, I tried to distract myself with chores. I swept the porch, scrubbed the kitchen sink, patched a loose board on the steps. But the ticking clock followed me from room to room. Its slow, Uneven rhythm, a constant reminder that time in Briar Hollow didn't belong to me. I called Margaret again, hoping for reassurance. She listened in silence, then spoke quietly. When you live alone out here, the house becomes your companion. Sometimes it's a little too good at keeping you company. She didn't ask for details. She didn't offer any stories of her own. Just her gentle voice, filling the space between my questions with something like understanding. That night, the whispers were bolder. The ticking clock seemed to fade, replaced by the steady, measured breaths of something just beneath my feet. I sat in bed, knees drawn to my chest, listening as the house confessed its secrets. Elijah, we remember, we wait. The words seeped into my dreams, threading themselves through visions of faces I'd never seen, rooms I'd never entered, sorrows I didn't yet understand. The clock ticked on, marking the hours until dawn, but time itself had become slippery, elastic, bound not to the present, but to memories buried deep in the dark. I realized then that Briar Hollow wasn't just haunted by ghosts or whispers. It was haunted by the past, by time itself folding and unfolding in endless, sorrowful loops. And I was caught in the middle, listening to a story that wasn't mine, but was desperate to be told. Chapter 5. The Hidden Room. If there is one truth about old houses, it's that they never truly belong to you. You may sign the deed, paint the walls, fill the shelves with your books and photographs, but every corner is haunted by the lives that came before. As my days in Briar Hollow multiplied, I found myself drawn again and again to the quiet mysteries beneath, its surface to the secrets sealed behind walls and beneath the creaking boards. It was during one of my sleepless nights that I first noticed the odd shadow beneath my bed. I'd been tossing restlessly, haunted by fragments of dreams, faces blurred by time, voices tangled in grief. The moon was thin and sickle-shaped, spilling pale light across the room in ragged slashes. Something on the floor caught my eye, a faint, irregular outline where the boards didn't quite meet. Curiosity sharpened my senses. I slipped from bed and knelt on the cold wood, fingers tracing the seams. The gap was barely there, the width of a blade, but when I pressed gently, the board moved. My heart hammered, half from fear, half from the strange excitement that always comes before an answer. I rummaged through a drawer and found a screwdriver, then worked the tool into the seam. The board creaked, stubborn, as if reluctant to yield. It's secret, but after a few moments of careful coaxing, it popped free. Beneath, darkness pooled, deep and absolute. I hesitated, breath caught in my throat. Then slowly, I reached down, my arm disappearing up to the elbow in the shadowy gap. My fingers brushed something soft, then something cold, a box, small and square, wrapped in what felt like oilcloth. I pulled it out, setting it on the bed. It was heavier than it looked, its surface rough with dust and age. The knot on the cloth was tight, but my hands worked quickly, almost desperate, and soon the covering slipped away. Inside, I found a faded photograph, the corners brittle and curled. 3 figures stood before Briar Hollow, as it had been decades ago, a tall man, a woman with sad eyes, and a little girl holding a rag doll, her face solemn, almost frightened. I studied the faces, searching for a spark of recognition, but the photograph was a mystery, its edges burned by time. Beneath the picture, a bundle of letters rested, tied with a ribbon gone, brown and threadbare. The ink had bled in places, the words slanting and urgent. I unfolded the topmost letter, careful not to tear the fragile paper. The handwriting was elegant, looping, and the words made my blood run cold. To whomever finds this, we are still here. We remember. We wait for someone to listen. A chill snaked up my spine. I sat back on my heels, the letter trembling in my grip. The room seemed smaller, pressed in by shadows that flickered and twisted at the corners of my vision. The whispers below the floorboards grew stronger, bolder, as if emboldened by my discovery. I replaced the board, tucking the letters and photograph beneath my pillow for the night. Sleep was impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the girl's face, pale and silent, her eyes begging for something I could not name. The next morning, I examined the rest of the letters by daylight. They told a story of a family unraveling, of a father lost to drink and sorrow, a mother vanishing into silence, a child who saw too much. The writer, always the mother, wrote of voices that came at night, whispers beneath the floor that grew louder with each passing year. Her final note was the most desperate, scrawled in shaking lines. If you find this, please remember us. Don't let us be forgotten. Don't let them win. Who were they? The house? The ghosts? Or the sorrows that lived here, year after year? All day, the unease grew. I walked the halls, trailing my hand along the walls, pausing to listen at every creak and sigh. The photograph weighed heavy in my pocket. Each time I looked at it, the girl's face seemed to sharpen, her eyes following me with silent, urgent longing. That night, the whispers beneath the floor were louder than ever. They rose in a chorus, voices overlapping, calling my name. Elijah, help us remember. I lay in the darkness, clutching the photograph, and whispered back, my words lost in the hush. I hear you. I remember. And in that lonely hour, I realized that the house was not just haunted by memories, but by the desperate hope of being remembered at all. Chapter 6. Letters from the past. Morning at Briar Hollow crept in quietly, the first rays of sun gently teasing the chill from the corners of my room. Sleep had been fitful, haunted by the memory of the photograph and the voices that seemed to rise and fall beneath me, always just beyond reach. I woke tangled in bedsheets, the letters from the hidden box pressed to my chest, their faded ink still echoing in my mind. My dreams had been crowded with unfamiliar faces blurred, half-remembered people whispering secrets I couldn't quite understand. I spent the early hours reading the letters one by one, my hands trembling as I unfolded each fragile sheet. The writing was delicate, looping, but the emotions that spilled onto the page were raw and desperate. Some letters were addressed to my dearest Lila, others simply to you, who will find this. Each began as a message of hope, but as the months and years stretched on, the tone changed, slipping slowly into despair. March 2nd, 1891. To my precious Lila, it snowed again last night. Your father is restless. He paces the halls as if searching for something he lost. I keep the lamp burning, hoping he'll come back to himself, but the shadows in this house grow longer every day. June 14th, 1892. If you hear the voices, do not answer them. That is what my mother always told me, but I am not as strong as she was. I hear them when I am alone, whispering from the dark. I think they remember us, even when we try to forget. The letters painted a picture of a family unraveling in slow motion, the weight of sorrow pressing down until even their words seemed too heavy to bear. There were mentions of the night callers, of laughter that turned to weeping in the walls, of secrets hidden not just in floorboards, but in hearts too weary to speak. As the years passed, the handwriting changed, becoming shaky and desperate, the lines broken by ink blots and smudged tears. One letter, dated only November, was little more than a plea. If you find this, I beg you remember us. The house is hungry. It will not rest until every voice is heard. We are not angry, just lost. Please listen. My throat tightened as I read. The loneliness that seeped from the pages was overwhelming, filling the room with a heavy ache I could not shake. It was as if the sorrow of every person who had lived here had sunk into the very bones of the house, pooling in its darkest corners, waiting for someone to bear witness. I spent the rest of the morning searching the house for more traces of its past. In the attic, beneath a pile of yellowed linens, I discovered a child's toy, a wooden horse. Its paint faded to the barest outline, one leg cracked. In a kitchen drawer, I found a brooch, its glass stone chipped, but still sparkling faintly in the light. Each item felt like a piece of a puzzle. I was only beginning to understand Dot by afternoon. A gentle rain had begun to fall, the sound drumming softly on the roof, soothing in its steadiness. I sat at the kitchen table, the letters spread before me, and began to write in my own journal. I copied passages from the letters, desperate to anchor their voices to the present, keep them from fading into silence again. The act of writing was grounding, but I could not shake the feeling that I was being watched, that every scratch of my pen was being measured and weighed by the unseen eyes of the house. Night fell quickly, drawing the familiar hush over Briar Hollow. I lit candles and sat in the parlor, the letters on my lap. The whispers began as soon as darkness pooled in the corners, faint, rhythmic, echoing the voices I had read all day. I closed my eyes and listened, my breath slow and steady. Elijah, remember, we're still here. I pressed my palm to the floor, feeling the vibration of their longing, the desperate ache for memory and release. I whispered back, voice trembling, I hear you. I remember. In that moment, the whispers seemed to ease, settling into a gentle, mournful lullaby that carried me into uneasy sleep. When I woke, dawn was already pushing at the edges of the world, painting the sky with soft gold and rose. The letters lay beside me. The ink faded, but no longer quite so desperate. I felt, for the first time, a sense of connection, not just to the house, but to every soul who had ever called it home. Briar Hollow, with all its secrets, was beginning to trust me. And I, in turn, was learning to trust its whispers. Chapter 7. The voice in the dark night in Briar Hollow was a different animal entirely. With the sun gone and the world outside reduced to inky silhouettes and muffled sighs of wind, the house seemed to grow larger, every shadow stretching, every echo doubling. The day's discoveries lingered like perfume, heavy and heady. I tried to busy myself, tidying up the kitchen, folding laundry, pacing from room to room in nervous patterns, but each step seemed to stir up memories that were not my own. When the last light finally faded and the clock signaled midnight with a single, reluctant chime, I surrendered, switching off the lamps and retreating to bed. I lay on my back, staring at the ceiling. The hush was absolute. Not a cricket, not a car, not even the distant bark of a dog. Just the soft, familiar ticking of the hallway clock and the sound of my own heart racing. Beneath it all, like a second pulse, was the expectation and ache that I could no longer pretend was just in my head. The whispers began almost immediately. Not the half-formed noises of restless wood or the scurrying of small creatures, but a persistent, deliberate murmuring, like voices on the other side of a thin wall. At first, I tried to ignore them, pulling the covers up to my chin, focusing on my breathing. But the voices were patient. They waited until my mind began to drift, until the darkness deepened, and the familiar outlines of the room softened and slipped away. Then, unmistakably, I heard it, a single, fragile word, clearer than before. Please. My eyes flew open. I sat up, heart pounding, every muscle in my body taut with fear and anticipation. The whisper was followed by another, softer and even sadder. Don't leave me. The sound was coming from beneath the floor. It was as if someone knew, as if a child was crouched beneath the boards, pressed flat against the underside, begging for company, for rescue, for remembrance. Who are you? I whispered into the darkness, my voice barely audible above the gentle cacophony. The answer came, slow and mournful, like the echo of a long-forgotten lullaby. I'm still here. For a long time, I sat motionless, straining to hear more. The voices did not frighten me anymore, not in the way they had before. There was pain in them, certainly, but also hope, a desperate, clinging hope that someone would listen, that someone would care. I rose from the bed and crossed the room, kneeling by the spot where I'd discovered the hidden compartment. I pressed my ear to the boards, feeling the chill seep into my skin. For a moment, there was only silence, then a burst of hurried whispers, overlapping, tripping over each other in their eagerness. Don't go. Stay with us. Tell our story. Tears stung my eyes. I wasn't sure why. Maybe the exhaustion, maybe the isolation, or maybe the simple, unbearable sadness of voices lost for so long, finally reaching the surface. I'm here, I said softly, barely trusting myself to speak. I'll stay, I promise. The room seemed to sigh in relief. The whispers faded, replaced by a gentle warmth, a sense of peace that was almost physical. I climbed back into bed, pulling the blankets up, and for the first time since arriving at Briar Hollow, I fell asleep quickly. My dreams filled with the sound of laughter and the smell of wildflowers blooming in spring. That night, the darkness was not so absolute. There was a lightness to it, a promise that whatever haunted the house was not angry, only lonely Dot. But as dawn broke, pale and shivering, I realized that my promise carried weight. The story was not finished. The house and those who lingered within still had secrets to reveal, and I, bound now by empathy and curiosity, was the only one left to listen. Chapter 8. The History of Briar Hollow. The morning after my promise, Briar Hollow felt changed, less oppressive, but also more alert, as if the very walls were listening for my next move. Light spilled across the kitchen in warm, golden bands, catching motes of dust that floated lazily in the quiet air. I made coffee, sat at the table, and tried to collect my thoughts. But the memories of the night clung to me like cobwebs. I knew I needed answers. The whispers, the letters, the photograph of the little girl. These fragments were threads, and I was determined to trace them back to their source. After breakfast, I pulled on my jacket and headed into town, determined to learn more about my mysterious new home. The local library was a squat brick building, dwarfed by ancient oaks and the shadows they cast. The librarian, a tall man with a careful smile, greeted me as I entered, his eyes lingering just a bit too long when I told him my address. Briar Hollow, you say? He repeated, his voice lowering. You're the first new resident there. In a long while. I shrugged off his curiosity and explained that I was interested in the house's history. With a knowing nod, he led me to the archives, a narrow room at the back, lined with shelves of brittle ledgers and yellowing newspapers. For hours, I pored over records, property deeds written in looping script, faded photographs of the house in every decade, census data that read like a list of ghosts. The story I uncovered was stranger than fiction. The Carmichael family, whose name was scrawled in so many of the letters, had built the house in 1874, carving a life from the wilderness with grit and hope. But hope, it seemed, had a way of curdling in Briar Hollow. The records told of harsh winters, failed crops, and eventually of tragedy. One year, the family simply vanished. No sale, no moving notice, just an abrupt end to their presence in the town's memory. The house passed through many hands after that. Some owners stayed for years, others only a season. Each family brought their own shadows, and nearly every name in the record was marked with a note: illness, bankruptcy, disappearance. There were stories whispered in old newspapers. A girl found wandering the fields in a nightgown. A man who claimed the walls sang to him at night. A mother who locked herself in the attic and was never seen again. No one stayed for long. No one, it seemed, left entirely unscathed. By early afternoon, my eyes ached from squinting at cramped handwriting. I gathered what notes I could and returned home, the sky growing heavy with the promise of rain. As I drove, my mind buzzed with half-formed questions and a sense of urgency that only deepened with every mile. Back at Briar Hollow, the air inside was thick with anticipation. I sat on the parlor floor, spreading out the copies of deeds and articles, cross-referencing every name and date with the letters I'd found. As I worked, the house seemed to grow quieter, the whispers ebbing to a hush, as if waiting for me to put the pieces together. I read the names aloud: Carmichael, Reynolds, Baker, Lee. Each name tasted strange on my tongue, weighted by the sorrow and hope that clung to their histories. With every connection, the faces in the photograph became clearer in my mind. The tall man, the sad-eyed woman, the little girl whose gaze had haunted my dreams dot by sunset. I knew more than I'd ever wanted. To about the misfortunes that had visited Briar Hollow. The tragedies that shaped the house were not random. They were part of a patternless cycle of hope, despair, and forgetting. Each family tried to make the place their own, but the house clung to its memories, refusing to let go. That night, as rain battered the windows and thunder rolled over the fields, I felt the old sorrow settle around me like a shroud. I sat in the dark, the records scattered across my lap, and listened as the whispers began again. They were softer now, less frantic, as if reassured by my efforts. Remember us. We're still here. We wait. For the first time, I understood. The house didn't want to hurt me. It wanted to be remembered, its stories told, its pain witnessed. The loneliness of Briar Hollow was not malevolent, but desperate a longing for someone to see, to listen, to care. I whispered into the darkness, my voice steady with new resolve. I remember. I will not forget. The wind howled, and the house seemed to sigh, and for a moment I thought I saw the little girl standing at the foot of my bed, her eyes bright with gratitude and something like relief. Chapter 9. Nightmares and Memories. Sleep became an uncertain visitor at Briar Hollow, reluctant and restless. Each night, as I crawled under the covers, the house seemed to breathe around me, a low, steady exhale that mingled with the sound of wind in the eaves and rain rattling softly against the glass. Sometimes, when I closed my eyes, I could almost believe I was alone, just another traveler, drifting through an old house's memory. But as soon as I let my guard down, the darkness filled with restless dreams. The first of these dreams came. Gently, a corridor stretched out before me, longer than any hall in Briar Hollow, lined with doors that opened and closed with silent precision. I drifted from room to room, searching for something I could not name. Shadows spilled across the floor, and every now and then I would glimpse the girl from the photograph, her small frame flitting just ahead, always out of reach. The second dream was different, more urgent. I was standing in the parlor, the grandfather, clock looming in the corner, its face warped and shifting. The ticking grew louder and louder until it drowned out everything else, then stopped. Silence crashed down like a wave. I reached out for the clock, but my hands passed through it nothing but smoke and memory. A voice, clear and pleading, echoed through the emptiness. Don't forget me. I woke gasping, heart hammering, sweat slick on my brow. My sheets were twisted tight around my legs, and for a moment I could not remember where I was. The room was cold, and the silence pressed in, suffocating an absolute dot. As the nights wore on, the dreams grew darker. Sometimes I wandered endless hallways, the walls pulsing with soft, sorrowful whispers. Sometimes the rooms were filled with strangers, men and women and children, all with hollow eyes and mouths sewn shut with shadow. They would turn to me in unison, reaching out with desperate hands, their fingers brushing my skin with a chill that lingered long after I woke. Other times, a girl would stand at the end of my bed, her eyes huge and bright, her lips moving. In frantic silence, I could never hear her words, but I always woke with a single thought pounding in my skull. She wants to be remembered. Days blurred into one another. I found myself drifting through the house in a haze of exhaustion, the weight of so many unspoken memories clinging to my skin. The boundaries between waking and dreaming began to blur. I would find myself standing in rooms I didn't remember entering, holding objects that were not mine: a ribbon, a small key, a scrap of paper with a child's scrawl. "Please come find me." The whispers beneath the floorboards became a constant companion. Sometimes they rose up around me as I worked, a low chorus that ebbed and flowed with my breath. Other times they fell silent, waiting, watching. I called Margaret more often now, seeking comfort in her gentle voice. I told her about the dreams, about the girl, about the growing sense that the house was trying to show me something. She listened patiently, her words always measured in calm. "Sometimes," she said, "places hold on to pain. It seeps in too, the walls into the ground. Maybe it's not about being haunted. Maybe it's about being remembered. You're listening, Elijah. That's more than most ever do." Her words soothed me, but they did not quiet the dreams. One evening, as twilight spilled across the fields and the first stars pricked through the velvet sky, I wandered into the attic. The air was thick with dust and memory, the beams overhead cobwebbed and ancient. I found myself drawn to an old trunk in the corner, its brass lock tarnished and half-dash broken dot inside. I found more fragments of lives, a child's drawing of a house, surrounded by stick-figure people, a letter addressed to Mama, a brittle strand of hair tied with blue ribbon. I sat on the floor, turning these objects over in my hands, feeling their weight, their longing. I realized then that Briar Hollow was not just a house. It was a vessel for memory, a place where stories refused to die. And I, for better or worse, was now part of that story. That night, I dreamed again of the endless hallway. But this time, as I followed the girl through door after door, I felt something shift, a warmth in my chest, a sense of purpose. When I reached her at last, she turned to me, her eyes shining with gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice clear and sweet as spring water. I woke before dawn, the room filled with a soft golden glow, and for the first time in weeks, I was not afraid. Chapter 10. The Gathering Dot. It was in the quiet hush of early morning that I first sensed the change. A subtle shift in the air, a tension beneath the surface, like the world holding its breath before a storm. I moved through Briar Hollow as if in a trance, each footstep softer, each breath more measured. The house seemed to listen, every creak and sigh echoing in the vast silence. The dreams and whispers had left their mark, and now, as dusk approached, I felt the story of this place rising up all around me, as if gathering for something inevitable. The weather was strange that day. Clouds churned low across the sky, smudging the sun and casting the house in a dim, expectant glow. A hush settled over the fields, birds falling silent, even the wind holding its tongue. I wandered the rooms restlessly, the letters and artifacts. Spread across the dining table a locket, a doll's ribbon, the faded photograph of the little girl. That afternoon, I lit candles in every room, the flickering flames casting long shadows that danced across the walls. I was not sure why I did it, perhaps to comfort myself, perhaps to invite whatever lingered in the darkness to step into the light. Each flame seemed to warm the air, pushing back the cold and uncertainty, filling the rooms with the soft, golden promise of memory. As twilight bled through the windows, the whispers began soft at first, almost shy, a tentative murmur just beneath the floorboards. I sat in the parlor, heart thumping, breath shallow. The voices gathered, rising in a slow, rhythmic tide. It was not just one voice now, nor even the girl's. It was a chorus, 100 voices, layered and overlapping, weaving together in a tapestry of longing and remembrance. Elijah, we are here. Don't forget. Listen. The words drifted up, fragile as cobwebs and just as persistent. Each voice was different, some high and childlike, others deep and weathered, all tinged with sorrow and hope. I closed my eyes, letting their stories wash over me, feeling the ache of their loneliness. The house pulsed with their presence. I could almost see them, shadows moving beneath the floorboards, faces pressed against the wood, hands reaching up, yearning for connection. The air shimmered with possibility. The sorrow was no longer something to fear, but something to embrace, to witness. I began to speak, my voice soft but steady, telling the house what I had learned. The stories of the Carmichael family, the mothers and children, the laughter and grief and loss. I spoke their names one by one, reading them aloud from the letters, letting the sound of them echo through the old rooms. The house seemed to settle, the tension easing, the voices growing quieter, more peaceful. For the first time, I sensed gratitude in the air, a warmth that wrapped around me, a comfort that felt as real as any embrace. The darkness no longer pressed in with dread, but with something close to relief. The house, it seemed, had been waiting for this moment, for someone to gather its memories, to speak them aloud, to honor those who had gone before. The chorus of whispers faded, replaced by a gentle, collective sigh. The air grew still, the candles flickering with a last breath of wind. I sat in the silence, heart full, feeling a sense of belonging I had not known since childhood. That night, I slept soundly, the dreams less troubled, the shadows gentler. In my sleep, I saw the girl once more. She stood at the foot of my bed, her eyes bright, her lips parted in a smile. "Thank you," she whispered. "We are not alone." I woke with the dawn, sunlight streaming through the windows, and knew that something had changed, not just in the house, but in me. Chapter 11. The Unraveling. The peace that settled over Briar Hollow after the gathering of voices was fragile, delicate as the dust motes spinning in sunbeams. For a day or two, the house felt lighter. The oppressive weight in the air diminished. The floorboards were quieter. The chill that clung to the rooms had softened, and I could move through the halls without constantly glancing over my shoulder. Even the whispers seemed more restful, gentle reminders, not desperate cries. But peace in a place like this is never simple, never permanent. As the days wore on, small disturbances crept back in, subtle at first, almost easy to ignore. Shadows began to gather in corners that had been bright just hours before. The air carried a tension I couldn't explain, a sense that something beneath the surface was shifting, churning, waiting to be revealed. It started with the objects. I'd wake to find the locket I'd left on the mantel, now sitting on my bedside table, the little doll's ribbon knotted around a kitchen drawer handle. The photograph of the girl appeared beside my pillow, though I could have sworn I'd tucked it into a box in the attic. Each time I found one of these items out of place, a shiver ran through me, not of fear, but of anticipation. I began to notice other oddities. The clock in the hallway ticked backward one evening, counting down the hours with a soft, persistent click. The windows misted over from the inside, obscuring the world outside, trapping me in a bubble of memory and longing. And always, beneath it all, was the feeling of being watched, not with malice, but with desperate hope. The whispers returned, changed now, no longer a unified chorus, but fragments of stories, pieces of lives torn apart and sewn back together. In the dark, sometimes I caught snippets of arguments, the echo of laughter, the high, sweet note of a lullaby sung in a voice thick with tears. Other times I heard only silence, heavy and absolute, as if the house itself was holding its breath. One evening, I found myself drawn to the attic again. The space was colder than usual, the air thick with the scent of old paper and forgotten. Dreams. I opened the trunk in the corner, rummaging through its contents until my fingers brushed against something unfamiliar, a small diary, its leather cover cracked and flaking. I opened it carefully. The pages were filled with spidery handwriting, the words tumbling over each other in frantic, urgent lines. They say you must never answer the whispers. But I am tired, so tired. The house remembers everything. The house is hungry for memory, for story. I am afraid if I stop writing, I will disappear altogether. Page after page, the diary chronicled a descent into isolation and despair. The author, a woman named Sarah, whose name I found in the old ledgers at the library, had come to Briar Hollow in the spring of 1927, full of hope and ambition. She wrote of long walks in the fields, of baking bread in the old oven, of laughter echoing in the halls. But as the months passed, her entries grew darker, filled with confusion and sorrow. The voices called to me at night. They want me to remember, to tell their stories. I am trying, but I am so tired. The final entry was little more than a scrawl. Ink splattered across the page. If anyone finds this, please listen. Tell them I tried. Tell them I remembered. I sat in the attic, the diary heavy in my hands, and felt the weight of 100 years of longing pressed down on me. The house was not just a vessel for memory. It was a crucible, a place where hope and despair battled endlessly, each refusing to let go. That night, the whispers came in a torrent, flooding the house with voices. I lay in bed, the diary pressed to my chest, and listened as stories unraveled all around me, stories of love and loss, of betrayal and forgiveness, of dreams kindled and dreams lost to the darkness. A single thread wound its way a plea, repeated over and over, growing softer with each telling. Remember us. Don't let us fade. In the heart of Briar Hollow, surrounded by the unraveling of so many lives, I made a vow. I would remember. I would carry their stories forward, refusing to let them disappear into silence. And as dawn crept in, painting the world in soft pink and gold, I knew that the real haunting was not by spirits or ghosts, but by the memories that refused to die. Chapter 12. The Choice. The air in Briar Hollow felt different, now thick with expectation, as if the house itself was holding out a hand in waiting for mine in return. After the diary, after the chorus of voices that threaded my nights, I sensed a crossroads approaching. Something had shifted. The whispers no longer pleaded simply to be remembered. They yearned for release. Spent the next days wandering through each room with a reverence I'd not felt before, pausing at every window, every alcove, every patch of sun-dappled floor. The house seemed alive with presence, its very walls pulsing with unspoken need. Even the smallest artifacts, the locket, the ribbon, the brittle photograph, seemed to shimmer with significance, as if waiting for a final gesture. It was in the parlor that I first heard the change. The voices, usually so mournful, now hummed with a peculiar urgency. Let us go, they whispered, voices entwined in longing. Set us free. I sat at the center of the room, sunlight splintering through the grimy windows, dust floating. Like golden motes, I turned the locket over in my hands, feeling its weight, the gentle warmth it had gathered from countless hands before mine. The photograph lay beside me, the little girl's eyes seeming to meet mine. Steady and solemn. As dusk gathered, the house settled around me, the silence thick and resonant. I heard footsteps above, then below, then behind the walls. The house was full of memory, full of hope, full of pain, but above all, full of waiting. I realized then that remembrance alone was not enough. The stories I had uncovered, the lives I had pieced together, the loneliness I had listened to, they were all asking for something more. A letting go, a blessing, a final gentle goodbye. That night, As the first stars blinked to life, I gathered all the artifacts I'd found. The locket, the ribbon, the letters, the photograph, the small wooden horse, the brooch, all the tokens of lives lived and lost. I laid them out on the parlor floor, their arrangement unplanned but perfect, as if guided by invisible hands. I knelt in the center of the room, hands trembling, breath slow. The voices swelled around me, filling the house with a sorrowful music. I spoke aloud, my words for them, for myself, for the house that had given shelter to so much longing. I see you, I said. I remember. I have heard your stories. You are not forgotten. The air grew warm, the candle flames steady and bright. I took the locket and, with careful fingers, slipped it into the gap between the floorboards. The photograph followed, then the ribbon, the horse, the brooch, the letters. One by one, each relic found its place in the darkness beneath the floor dot. As I pressed the last letter into the space, I felt the boards quiver beneath my touch. A wave of energy swept through the room, gentle but powerful, like the exhale of a deep, long-held breath. The voices rose in a single harmonious note, a sound both joyful and bittersweet. "Thank you," they whispered. "Let us go." The room seemed to brighten, the shadows receding. I knelt for a long time, tears spilling down my face, listening as the last echoes of the voices faded into the quiet. The silence that followed was profound, sacred, as if the house itself had exhaled the weight of centuries. I sat there until dawn, the new day flooding the parlor with light. The floor beneath me felt lighter, the air easier to breathe. The house was quieter now, its endless need gentled, its stories finally at peace. I knew then that I had been given a gift, and in return, I had given one back a kind of release, a blessing not just for the house, but for myself. Chapter 13. Dawn, morning, arrived with a gentleness I had not known since first setting foot in Briar Hollow. The sunlight crept in golden and slow, warming the floorboards that had so long been cold. I awoke in my bed, tangled in the covers, the air around me light and easy for the first time in months. There was a hush to the house, but it was no longer the heavy, breathless silence of before. It was a quiet born of relief, of peace restored after a long night of storms. I rose and padded barefoot down the stairs. Each board underfoot felt springier, almost grateful. The kitchen, once always in shadow, now glowed softly in the morning light. I brewed coffee and stood at the window, watching mist roll over the fields as the day unfurled itself in gentle blues and golds. For the first time since I arrived, I felt like the house truly belonged to me, and I to it. I moved from room to room, opening curtains and windows, letting fresh air sweep away the last of the old, stifling sorrow. The rooms responded in kind. The hallway was less dim, the attic less foreboding, the parlor nearly cheerful as the light danced across the faded wallpaper. Everywhere I looked, the objects of memory photographs, letters, the small wooden horse were gone from sight, laid to rest with care beneath the floor. Only a faint imprint on the dust and a lingering warmth on the boards marked the places where they had been. I knelt and pressed my palm to the floor in the parlor, closing my eyes, feeling for the pulse of the house beneath my skin. There was still a presence there, but it was gentle, a soft hum, the echo of gratitude. On my bedside table, I found the photograph of the little girl one last time. Her face, so often drawn with sorrow, seemed to have softened. Her eyes were peaceful, her mouth almost smiling. Beneath the photograph was a note in a delicate, looping hand, ink as faint as breath. "Thank you for listening. You have given us rest." I sat quietly for a long time, letting the words settle in my chest. The loneliness I'd carried for so long, eased, replaced by a sense of belonging I'd never expected to find in a forgotten house at the edge of the world dot as the day wore on. I wandered outside, breathing deep of the cool, sweet air. The yard, too, felt changed. The grass grew greener, wildflowers nodding in the breeze. Birds called from the hedgerows, their songs bright and insistent, and even the old barn seemed to stand taller. Neighbors, those few souls who lived scattered across the fields, waved as they passed, their smiles friendlier, less guarded. I realized then that I had become a part of this place, stitched into its patchwork of memory and hope. I had listened, and in doing so, I had healed something both in the house and in myself. That night, as dusk returned and the sky blushed, with lavender and rose, I sat in the parlor once more, a cup of tea warming my hands. The house was silent, except for the soft ticking of the hallway clock, the sound now comforting instead of foreboding. The shadows in the corners were just shadows, no longer thick with secrets or sorrow. And as sleep found me easily, I dreamed not of endless halls or desperate voices, but of sunlight and laughter, of wildflowers blooming in fields of gold, of a little girl waving goodbye from the threshold as she walked into the light. When I woke, I felt rested in a way I hadn't in years. The new day, and every day after, dawned bright and full of possibility. Chapter 14. A house remembers Dot in the days that followed. Life at Briar Hollow settled into a new rhythm, one colored by calm rather than uncertainty. I found myself waking earlier, eager to greet the morning light as it filled the kitchen, and painted the fields beyond my window in shifting golds and greens. The house, once a brooding labyrinth of shadows and echoes, now felt like a companion and old friend at peace, its burdens finally set down. But the truth about old houses is that they never forget. The memories they hold may fade and soften, becoming something closer to dreams than nightmares, but they are always there, woven into the grain of every floorboard and the whisper of wind through the eaves. Some evenings, as the sun slipped below the horizon and dusk gathered around the porch, I would pause at the threshold, listening to the hush that settled over the fields. It was a different kind of silence, one filled with gratitude and a gentle longing. I realized then that the house did not resent its memories, nor did it fear them. It cherished the lives it had sheltered, the stories it had held safe in darkness, waiting for someone to care enough to listen. I kept the little girl's photograph. On my desk, framed now, her gentle smile a reminder of the promise I had made and kept. Sometimes, in the lull between chores, or as I wrote in my journal late into the night, I would speak aloud to her, to the house, to the invisible souls who had walked these rooms before me. I remember, I would say, voice quiet but certain, I won't let you fade. In those moments, I could feel a warmth around me, a hush that was no longer empty but alive, filled with kindness and acceptance. It was as if the house was grateful, not just for being remembered, but for being understood. Neighbors continued to stop by, their visits more frequent, their conversations easier. Margaret Hemsworth came for tea, bringing stories of the land and its people, her laughter echoing in the sunlit kitchen. We spoke of gardens and harvests, of seasons past and seasons yet to come. I found comfort in these simple rituals, each one anchoring me more firmly to Briar Hollow and its gentle, haunted peace dot at night. As I prepared for bed, I sometimes caught a faint, familiar whisper softer than before, more a memory than a voice. It did not unsettle me. Instead, it brought a smile, a sense of connection to the long chain of lives and loves that had shaped this house before I ever crossed its threshold. Lying in bed, I would listen to the creak of the floorboards, the sigh of the wind, the faint echo of laughter from decades past. The house remembered, yes, but now, so did I, Dot, and in that shared remembrance, we found a kind of quiet joy. Chapter 15. Whispers never fade. Years passed quietly, each one softening the memory of that first winter in Briar Hollow, but never quite erasing it. My hair grew streaked with gray. The garden I'd planted grew wild and lush, teeming with birds and bees each spring. The old house aged gracefully, its paint peeling a little more, its steps sinking further into the earth, but it stood tall against the winds and the passing storms. I, too, changed, becoming not just a resident, but a steward of stories. Life settled into its gentle routines. Each morning, I greeted the sun as it climbed above the fields, sipping coffee by the window while the world yawned awake around me. Neighbors became friends. Their children grew, their laughter echoing across the yards in the golden light of summer evenings. Margaret Hemsworth passed away one autumn, her absence mourned by all, but her kindness lingered in the recipes she'd shared, the blankets she'd knitted, the stories she'd left behind. Through it all, Briar Hollow remained a living memory. The room stayed bright, filled with the ordinary magic of everyday life, meals cooked, books read, small repairs made. Yet every so often, the house would remind me of its depths. In the hush before a storm, or the late-night quiet when the world seemed wrapped in velvet darkness, I'd hear a whisper soft, affectionate, a ripple beneath the floorboards. The voices no longer pleaded or cried. Instead, they sang in gentle harmony, content and at peace. Sometimes I'd find myself awake in the dark, staring at the ceiling as rain tapped softly on the glass. I'd listen for the old secrets, for the memories etched into every beam and nail, and smile to myself. The little girl's photograph, still on my desk, watched over me like a guardian, her eyes bright, her story now forever told. Visitors would ask, now and then, about the history of the house. I would share what I knew, stories of the Carmichaels, of sorrow and hope, of the long, patient waiting that had finally been answered. I'd watch their faces as they listened, some skeptical, some moved, all quietly respectful. Briar Hollow's reputation soft in the community. People spoke of it with affection, as a house that had seen much, endured much, and survived with its heart intact. And sometimes, young people curious and a little braver than they ought to be would ask me if the house was haunted. I'd smile, pouring them tea, and say, not haunted, just full of memories. And memories, if you treat them kindly, can be the best company of all. I lived a long time at Briar Hollow. Even as the world beyond grew louder, faster, and less patient, the house remained a haven, an anchor. My days grew slower, but never lonely. The whispers never faded completely, but they were no longer cries in the night. They were lullabies, blessings, the house's way of saying thank you for listening. And so, as I grew older, I understood. Some places never truly let you go. Some stories want only to be heard, to be remembered. Briar Hollow and I grew old together, two keepers of each other's histories. On my last morning there, years and years after I first arrived, I sat once more on the porch as the sun rose over the fields. I listened not for sorrow or fear, but for the gentle hum of life in the walls and the warmth beneath the floor. The whispers, so long a mystery, had become a comfort, a gentle reminder that I belonged here, and always would. And as the light spilled across the floorboards, I whispered, my thanks, knowing it would be heard and cherished forever. Conclusion. The story of Briar Hollow is not one of ghosts or terror, but of remembrance and healing. A story spun quietly in the darkness, told not with screams, but with gentle whispers. When I first crossed the threshold, I carried with me the weight of my own loneliness, convinced that silence was an enemy to be conquered, that shadows should be feared. But the old house taught me otherwise. Beneath its creaking floors and peeling paint, it held the stories of generations, the dreams and heartbreaks, the laughter and grief, the lives lived and lost in the slow, turning seasons of time. I came seeking solitude, hoping to escape the noise and chaos of a world too busy to care. Instead, I found a kind of company I never expected. A chorus of memory that wanted only to be heard, to be honored. Listening became my comfort, my purpose. Each letter, each artifact, each faded photograph was a thread connecting me to the past. By bearing witness, I allowed the pain and longing of those who came before me to find release. The house changed? Yes, but so did I. I learned to embrace the hush, to find solace in the stories that live beneath my feet, to feel gratitude for the chance to be part of something larger than myself. The world beyond Briar Hollow moved on. Seasons spinning past, new names joining the old on the mailbox, new laughter echoing through the halls. The memories I gathered, the promises I kept, became part of the house's fabric, woven into its very bones. And though time may take me, as it does all things, I know that the house will remember, that it will hold my story alongside all the sizz, others whispering it softly to those who care enough to listen down. So if you ever find yourself in an old place where silence lingers and the shadows seem to breathe, don't turn away. Listen. Remember, be gentle with the stories you find, for every whisper is a memory longing to be cherished. Every floorboard a secret waiting for a kind soul to set it free. And if, in the quiet of the night, you hear a voice calling your name from beneath the floorboard's answer, for sometimes that voice is not a ghost at all, but the echo of your own heart, searching for belonging, yearning to be heard, at last, in the darkness.